The set of Good Morning America gleamed under the studio lights like a stage waiting for drama. The audience, already buzzing with anticipation, was thrilled to see Samuel L. Jackson, a legend in every sense, joining George Stephanopoulos for what was supposed to be a lighthearted interview about his upcoming film, The Reckoning. But as anyone who knew Jackson could have guessed, things weren't going to stay lighthearted for long. The cameras rolled, the familiar theme music faded, and George smiled into the lens. Good morning, America. Our next guest needs no introduction, one of Hollywood's most iconic voices, a man whose roles have defined generations. Please welcome Samuel L. Jackson. Applause erupted as Jackson walked in, smooth and confident in a dark leather jacket, shades perched on his face, and that unmistakable swagger. He greeted George with a handshake, sat down, and grinned at the cheering audience. Samuel, George began warmly, great to have you back on the show. Glad to be here, man, Jackson replied, his tone casual but sharp. Been a while since I did morning TV. Y'all get up early. The crowd laughed, easing into the rhythm. For the first few minutes, it was standard fare, film clips, anecdotes, a few laughs about on-set mishaps. Jackson talked about working with new directors and how The Reckoning pushed him creatively. But beneath the smiles, there was an unmistakable edge in his tone, a simmering tension that hinted something deeper was waiting to surface. George leaned in with that polished curiosity he'd honed over decades. The movie's about corruption, power, and the people caught in between. Some say it's got a political message. Were you trying to make a statement? Jackson raised an eyebrow, tilting his head slightly. You could say that, but you don't have to try to make a statement when the truth's staring everybody in the face. I mean, look around, half the stuff in that movie feels like a documentary. The audience gave a nervous laugh. George smiled tightly. You're talking about the political climate. I'm talking about the system, Jackson said, his voice deepening. Corruption doesn't wear party colors, George. It wears suits, smiles for cameras, and acts like it's helping people while it's robbing them blind. A flicker crossed George's face. He wasn't expecting the conversation to veer there, not on a weekday morning broadcast meant to keep things easygoing. You've always been outspoken, he said carefully. But some critics say your recent comments, especially about certain leaders, have been divisive. Jackson leaned forward, his tone sharpening. Divisive? You mean telling the truth's divisive? Let me tell you something, man, what's really divisive is when people in power mess up lives and then get folks to fight each other over the mess they made. George tried to maintain composure. I understand your passion, but don't you think the tone sometimes alienates people who might otherwise agree with you? Jackson let out a low laugh, shaking his head. There it is again, tone. People love talking about my tone when they can't argue with the facts. My tone ain't the problem. The problem is that people like their truth sugar-coated, and I don't do that. The room tensed. The live audience had gone quiet, waiting to see where this would go. George, trained to handle pressure, attempted a light pivot. Well, the film certainly brings those issues to the surface. But let's talk about. No, let's not skip past that, Jackson interrupted. You know why people don't trust interviews like this anymore? Because we dance around the real talk. Folks are losing their homes, losing faith, and y'all smile into the camera saying, we'll be right back after this break. That's the problem. George blinked, visibly caught off guard. The producer in his earpiece was already muttering frantic suggestions, but he ignored it. With all due respect, Samuel, we cover those stories every day. That's literally my job. Jackson pointed slightly, not aggressively but with emphasis. You cover them, yeah, but do you challenge the people behind them? Or just let them spin their stories because they've got fancy titles? The audience gasped. One woman in the front row whispered something to her friend. The tension was palpable now, thick enough to taste. George sat back, voice calm but his jaw tight. Samuel, we try to provide balance. We ask tough questions to everyone. Balance, Jackson said with a smirk. That word's funny. You give both sides airtime, even when one side's lying through their teeth. That's not balance, George. That's pretending ignorance is just another opinion. Silence blanketed the studio. Even the camera operators hesitated to zoom in. George tried to reclaim the moment. I think viewers can decide for themselves who's lying and who's not. Jackson gave a small, incredulous laugh. Viewers can't decide when the truth's filtered before it even reaches them. That was it. The energy shifted completely. George looked frustrated now, his voice dipping into defensive territory. Samuel, this is a morning show, not a debate stage. Jackson's tone turned cool, almost dismissive. Exactly. That's the problem. Nobody wants a debate unless it's scripted. And then he stood up. The audience murmured, confused. George raised his hand slightly. Wait, Sam, are you leaving? Jackson unclipped his mic, tossing it gently on the table. I'm done, man. I said what I came to say. You wanted to talk about truth, but I see how it is. Samuel, come on, we're live, George said, trying to keep his voice steady. We can finish this civilly. Jackson turned, his expression unreadable behind his sunglasses. Civilly's just another word for quietly. And I don't do quiet. And with that, he strode off the set. The studio audience sat in stunned silence as the director cut to commercial. The instant the cameras stopped rolling, the room erupted, crew members talking over each other, producers rushing to George's side, PR teams on the phone already trying to spin the story. George exhaled, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Well, he muttered into his mic that was still live to the crew, that was something. Within minutes, clips of the confrontation hit social media. Someone in the audience had recorded the entire exchange from their phone. By the time ABC issued a bland statement about creative differences during a spirited discussion, hashtag Samuel L. Jackson storms off was trending worldwide. Some viewers called Jackson a hero for calling out the media facade. Others said he'd lost his temper on live TV. But either way, everyone was talking about it. In Hollywood, controversy often fades fast, but this one was different. This wasn't a movie script. This was Samuel L. Jackson, unfiltered, taking on one of the most composed journalists in America, and walking away without regret. For viewers, it was shocking. For producers, it was chaos. But for Samuel L. Jackson, it was just another morning of speaking his mind, whether the cameras were ready or not. By the afternoon, the internet was on fire. The clip of Samuel L. Jackson walking off Good Morning America wasn't just trending, it had become the cultural lightning rod of the day. News outlets ran headlines like, Samuel L. Jackson storms off set after heated exchange with George Stephanopoulos, while social media exploded with reactions ranging from outrage to admiration. On Twitter, fans posted memes of Jackson dropping his mic, others edited the footage with dramatic music from Pulp Fiction. On Instagram, celebrities weighed in. Jamie Foxx commented, "That's vintage Sam right there, unfiltered truth." Meanwhile, others accused him of disrespecting the press. The debate wasn't just about what happened, it was about what it meant. Inside Jackson's Los Angeles home, things were calm, eerily so. He sat on his back porch, sipping coffee, sunglasses still on, scrolling through the chaos. Damn, he muttered, shaking his head. Y'all really turned a 5-minute truth session into a global event. His phone wouldn't stop buzzing. His publicist, Marla, had called him 5 times already. Finally, he answered. Sam, please tell me you're not on social media, she said, exasperated. I might be, he replied, smirking. Do me a favor, stop reading comments. The internet's melting down. ABC just released a statement saying they respect diverse opinions, whatever that means. That's corporate talk for, we don't want smoke, Jackson said dryly. They'll be fine, fine, Marla said, you just made national news for storming off live television. Some people are calling for an apology. Jackson chuckled, they'll have to wait a long time for that one. He hung up and leaned back in his chair. For him, this wasn't about ego, it was about honesty. You don't invite Samuel L. Jackson on live TV and expect me to whisper, he said to himself. Later that evening, he met a few close friends for dinner at a private restaurant in Beverly Hills. Quentin Tarantino, as usual, was among them, along with Lawrence Fishburne and Regina King. When he walked in, everyone clapped and laughed. Man, you broke breakfast television, Lawrence said. They're calling it the Jackson meltdown. Jackson laughed, sitting down. A meltdown, please. That was me being polite. Quentin grinned across the table. You know what's wild? That whole scene felt like one of my scripts. 2 men talking, tension building, and then bam. You walk out before the commercial break. Pure cinema. Yeah, well, next time, they better roll credits when I leave, Jackson said. Regina shook her head, half amused, half concerned. You know how this works, Sam. The media loves you when you're outspoken, until it's inconvenient. They'll paint you however they want. Jackson nodded. Let him. I'm not here to be convenient. Across the country in New York, George Stephanopoulos was facing his own storm. The GMA team had been in emergency meetings all afternoon, discussing how to handle the fallout. Producers argued about whether to invite Jackson back or let the story fade. George, still rattled, kept replaying the confrontation in his head. He caught me off guard, George admitted to his producer quietly. But maybe he wasn't entirely wrong. About what? She asked. George sighed. About how we cover things. Maybe we have gone soft sometimes. We try so hard to be neutral that we end up sounding numb. The producer frowned. You want to go public with that? No, George said, straightening his tie. Not yet. By the next morning, think pieces flooded the internet. The Atlantic published an article titled, When Truth Meets Television, Samuel L. Jackson's Wake-Up Call. Another headline from Variety read, Did Samuel L. Jackson just expose the hypocrisy of morning TV? Cable news networks aired segments replaying the clip, slowing it down frame by frame like it was the Zapruder film. Body language experts were brought in. Pundits debated whether Jackson's outburst was justified. The story had escaped Hollywood, it had become a national conversation. Meanwhile, Jackson was doing what he did best, keeping it real. When he appeared on The Daily Show later that week, Trevor Noah welcomed him with a grin and a standing ovation from the audience. Samuel L. Jackson, ladies and gentlemen, Trevor said. Man, you've been trending for days. How does it feel to break the internet without a movie or a Marvel cameo? Jackson laughed. Feels like people finally listening. I said one thing about truth, and everybody lost their damn minds. Trevor nodded, amused. Well, you didn't just say it, you dropped the mic and walked out. That was a power move. Jackson shrugged. Sometimes the best way to make a point is to stop talking. The crowd erupted in cheers. He used the rest of the interview to redirect attention to the reckoning, describing it as a story about people who look away too long. The irony wasn't lost on anyone watching. His real-life confrontation had become the perfect metaphor for his movie's message. By the end of the week, the tide began to turn in his favor. Fans rallied behind him online. Hashtags like #Jackson was right and #TruthAintDivisive started trending. Even some journalists, quietly, admitted he'd sparked an overdue conversation about media accountability. George, for his part, handled it with dignity. On a later GMA broadcast, he addressed the situation briefly. Sometimes discussions get heated, he said, looking into the camera. But that's part of open dialogue. I have deep respect for Samuel L. Jackson, his passion, his honesty, and his art. We might have disagreed, but it came from a place of caring about truth. The comment earned quiet applause in the studio, and Jackson later reposted the clip with the caption, Respect where it's due. Behind the scenes, ABC executives couldn't deny the numbers. Ratings had soared after the incident, and clips from the episode became the most viewed GMA content of the year. What began as a PR headache had turned into a ratings goldmine. When The Reckoning premiered 2 weeks later, it dominated the box office. Critics hailed it as one of Jackson's most powerful performances in years. Reviewers even mentioned the GMA incident as part of the cultural momentum behind it, calling it a real-life act of conviction that mirrored his character's defiance on screen. At the premiere afterparty in Los Angeles, Jackson stood on a balcony overlooking the city lights. Music pulsed from inside, laughter filled the air, and photographers waited by the entrance. Quentin joined him with 2 glasses of champagne. To controversy, Quentin toasted, the best publicity money can't buy. Jackson clinked his glass. To truth, he corrected, smirking. Even when it makes people uncomfortable. They drank, and for a moment, everything felt poetic, like the world had caught up with what Jackson had always been saying. A few days later, George Stephanopoulos received a package at his office. Inside was a signed The Reckoning poster, with a note scribbled across the top. Greater than, no hard feelings. Just keeping it real. SLJ. George smiled. He pinned it on his office wall. Fair enough, he murmured. Weeks passed, but people were still talking about that morning. Media schools analyzed it as a case study in authenticity versus polish. Viewers remembered it as the moment live TV stopped feeling rehearsed. For Samuel L. Jackson, it became another legendary chapter in a career defined by honesty and fire. He didn't just storm off a set, he'd stormed straight into the heart of a conversation America didn't even know it needed. And as he told a reporter months later, when asked if he regretted walking off. Regret? Nah, you can't regret truth. You can only regret not saying it loud enough.